Men accused of participating in the robbery of an Auckland dairy, which resulted in the death of a worker, have appeared here at the High Court in Auckland together.
Guys, this case is horrific. It's about a man who was just trying to create a better life for his family, and in an act of senseless violence, he was taken away from the world, he was taken away from his family, and the perpetrator really had no connection to him. I'm going to take you inside this case today. Just prepare yourselves, because it's pretty horrific and one of the most senseless murders that I have ever covered on Red Rum. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. I upload 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week, so make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. It was supposed to be a dream, a fresh start in this new city, new job, a chance to really build his life. Janak had always envisioned having this kind of future that was his own. But just days after arriving in Auckland, Janak Patel's life took a tragic turn and would have a violent end. An ordinary evening at the neighbourhood shop turned into a nightmare. What happened outside the Rose Cottage at Supret that night? Let's unravel the tragedy of Janak Patel's final night. Janak's life began in the sunlit streets of Navsari, a city in India. Born into a close-knit family deeply rooted in their cultural and religious traditions, Janak grew up surrounded by this vibrant tapestry of Gujarati life. Even as a boy, his gentle nature, his humility, and his quiet determination really made him stand out. But as Janak got older, his dreams really stretched beyond the familiar confines of Navsari. Janak was driven by a combination of ambition, the desire for a new kind of life, new opportunities, and the hope of building an even better future for himself and his family. Like many young people from small towns across India, he had always dreamed of exploring life beyond the familiar confines of his local community. He had a quiet yet determined sense of ambition, one that urged him to seek out experiences that would broaden his horizons. For Janak, this wasn't about escaping anything. This was about exploring opportunities that were greater than what he had in his little town. It was whilst he was still living there that he met his wife, Vijeta. Now, he and Vijeta, their connection wasn't immediate. It was something that kind of grew over time, and it was through these really quiet moments of sharing like values, sharing interests. It was a real foundation that would eventually lead to marriage. Vijeta was someone who shared Janak's values of working hard, of ambition. She was grounded and intelligent. She had this real quiet strength about her, qualities that her new husband deeply adored. They began to spend more time together talking about their hopes, their dreams, their futures. Their conversations often drifted towards aspirations for a better life. And so after their marriage, Janak and Vijeta spent some time together in Gujarat before Janak eventually made the decision to move to the UK. He moved there in the early 2000s, and he had moved there for work. Now, Janak decided to make the leap, and he soon settled in the UK. He really got to know everyone he was working with. And he did face challenges adapting to this brand new culture, a completely new language, and of course lifestyle. But he was no stranger to hard work, and quickly he immersed himself in his new life and he gained friends. But the separation was difficult, especially for Vijeta, who had to stay behind. She was caring for her family and she couldn't leave them. And of course, she and her husband, they kept in close contact through this time, through phone calls and through letters. And Janak's thoughts were always with her. And in fact, it seemed that their bond only deepened over the distance, and as they kind of shared their experiences and dreams for the future, they knew that this was all for a bigger picture. They would be together again soon. And over the years, Janak found a real sense of stability in the UK. But his thoughts would always return to his family and the life that he wanted to build. By the time Janak reunited with his wife Vijeta, after the long separation, and it was even longer because of COVID-19. Now, by this time when they reunited, he had become increasingly focused on building something tangible, a business of his own. By that point, he'd been in the UK for over 10 years. So when the opportunity came about to move somewhere else, to New Zealand, it was the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. The couple finally reunited after lockdown, and they made this decision to move together to New Zealand in November of 2022. They moved to Auckland, New Zealand's largest city, and they moved there to manage the Rhodes Cottage Supret in Sandringham. The opportunity came up because the people who owned the shop were going travelling, and so it felt like the perfect stepping stone towards their ultimate dream of owning their own business. It was on the evening of November 23rd, 2022, that Janak was working at the Rose Cottage Supret, and he was behind the counter. He was kind of wrapping up his shift, getting ready to kind of settle down for the night. Janak had no way of knowing that there were two men outside, and those men had been watching the store, and they were planning something sinister. The first man, 37-year-old Peter Hobson, wore this kind of black bandana that concealed his face, and his partner in crime, Shane Henry Tane, 44, he absolutely played his part, setting the stage for what was about to happen. They, of course, were not there to shop. They were there to rob. The plan was simple: strike quickly, take whatever they could, and then leave. But things did not go as smoothly as they had initially planned. Hobson burst through the door. He rushed behind the counter where Janak was stood. The noise of his footsteps echoed in this kind of really small space, and he forced his way through this set of closed wooden panels to the cash register. Now, at that moment, Janak did not hesitate. He would have seen the man's knife. He was holding it. He would have seen that glint of steel catching the dim store light. Hobson was armed, and he was dangerous. But Janak was not going to back down. This was his business. This was his livelihood. He had been trusted, and he'd made a promise to himself that he wouldn't do anything to jeopardise these dreams that he'd built for his family's future. His wife, Vegeta, had been in the front of the store, and she had kind of heard the commotion. Now, on this, she panicked. She ran immediately to the back room. But Janak stayed. He stood his ground. Hobson, however, was not intimidated. With the knife in his right hand, Hobson advanced towards him. Janak then retreated to the back room and into the back room, but he wasn't going to run for long. Instead, as Hobson continued his theft, grabbing the cash register, even some vapes and some lighters, Janak reappeared, and this time he was holding a hockey stick. The battle that followed was nothing short of desperate. Janak charged out after Hobson, and he was determined to retrieve whatever Hobson had taken. It wasn't just about the money for him. It was about protecting the little that he had for the future he dreamed of. What followed was a chase. Janak swung that hockey stick with force at Hobson, and he struck him, and each strike was fueled by adrenaline and just the will to survive, really. But Hobson was not backing down. He moved quickly, sidestepping, putting distance between himself and Janak, but he was not finished. Hobson waited for Janak to swing the stick once more, and that was when the fatal moment came. As Janak swung the stick again, Hobson dropped the tree branch, which he'd been holding in his other hand, and that allowed him really free movement, and then he lunged towards him with the knife. He pushed Janak to the ground, pinning him down. Hobson knelt over Janak, and he held him down with his left hand. And then with brutal precision, he began to stab him, each strike coming quickly, violently, and one after another after another. Now Janak, though he was wounded, he did not give up. He fought back. He wrestled with Hobson for the hockey stick, trying to break free, but Hobson was too strong. He was too relentless. The blade struck again and again, each blow more desperate than the last. Janak fought through the pain. He was struggling to stay alive at this point, but even with his determination, even trying to fight back, it was no use. Finally, Hobson delivered the fatal blow, a stab to Janak's neck, and that was enough to end the fight. That was when Janak staggered back, and he did try to escape, but the strength was gone from his limbs. He tried to run back inside the store, but after taking just a few steps back, his body gave out and he collapsed. His blood then began staining the pavement beneath him, And Hobson, the man who had just ended his life, did not hesitate. He picked up the stolen wheelie bin that he'd gotten, and it was now filled with the cash register and all of the other things he'd taken. And he just calmly walked away, as though nothing had happened. Janak Patel's life had been brutally cut short just days after his arrival in New Zealand. His death was a tragedy that would haunt those who knew him, those who loved him, and in fact the whole nation who really struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Vegeta would be left to piece together the fragments of their shattered life, while the rest of his family back home in Gujarat, they would just completely struggle to understand how such a vibrant young man's life could be taken. How could this happen to their beloved son, their brother? And Janak had not been there long at all, but he had started to immerse himself in the community. He knew how to do that. He'd obviously completely relocated to a new country, to the UK before, and so he'd already started to get to know people, and neighbours would describe him as a kind soul who had come to New Zealand with his heart full of hope. And his passing really would underscore the kind of harsh realities faced by small business owners, many who work really long hours in vulnerable conditions. It was just something he felt he had to do. Now, what I will say is that I was looking up murders in New Zealand as just general part of research, and there's a Wikipedia page. It is not extensive by any means, but on the New Zealand specific, this was the only murder that has been documented in that year, in 2022, which is kind of insane. As someone who researches murders from the US and the UK, the US especially, there are so many, like the list is just so extensive. And on this one particular source, so again, it's not extensive, but on this one particular source, that was the only murder in 2022 that is documented there. This is just not something that happens in New Zealand. It is generally thought of as a really safe place. And so this was incredibly shocking to the entire nation. Now, after the murder, Hobson, who had, as we know, initially fled the scene, he was apprehended in Auckland, and this was just a few days after the murder. Hobson's arrest and subsequent trial became the focal point of much public outrage, to be honest. During the investigation, authorities discovered that Hobson had an extensive criminal record. And these included things like assaults, burglaries, and drug abuse. Despite the nature of his previous crimes, his involvement in this murder completely shocked anyone who knew him. It seemed to really escalate to a level of violence beyond any of his previous convictions or criminal behaviour. Now, the other man involved in the crime was 44-year-old Shane Henry Taine. Now, while Taine was not directly involved in the actual fatal stabbing, he was considered a co-defendant because he played a crucial role in the robbery that preceded the murder. He had been part of the planning and part of the execution of the robbery at Rose Cottage. Taine was originally charged with murder, but this was later changed and it was reduced to aggravated robbery. It just became really clear that he physically was not present during the murder, and so he couldn't be charged with the murder. He'd not been at the scene when Janak was stabbed. He was, however, found accountable for his participation in the criminal activity. The prosecution argued that he was complicit in the violent crime itself. At the trial, Hobson's guilty plea and his remorse, which was expressed in a letter to Janak's family, were taken into account. But the judge made it clear that remorse alone would not mitigate the severity of the crime. And Hobson's criminal history was a significant factor in the eventual sentence that he was given. Hobson was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum non-parole term of 16 years. The trial itself was, of course, a really painful and emotional ordeal for Janak's family, especially for his wife, his widow, who had to come to terms with the fact that she lost her husband in the most brutal way. Her husband was taken from her and he was never coming back, all because he was trying to create a better life for her and their family. Thank you for watching this episode of Red Rum. My recommendation today, guys, I feel really embarrassed that I haven't already read this. I think I've probably read bits of it and I've seen the film, but I am currently reading The Shining. So for those of you who don't know, the word red rum is murder backwards, and I don't know if this is the first time it was used. It's certainly the first time I know about it or have known about it. Is in the film, and it's said over and over again. And it's kind of why this podcast or this show is called Red Rum. So I thought, you know what, I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to properly read it. So I'm about halfway through that, and oh, it's great. What did I read? I read The Green Mile. I'm just seeing if it's on my bookshelf. Yeah, it's hiding somewhere. But I read The Green Mile maybe last year and thought that was so phenomenal. I loved the film of that as well. I've always watched the film first and then read the book later. And that's what I've done with The Shining. But yeah, I'm really enjoying it. So if you are a fan of Stephen King and you've not read that, highly recommend. Other than that, I'll see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.